The morning sun bathed the university campus in gold, dancing through the tree-lined walkway like a procession of quiet memories. Parents in crisp suits and silk scarves hurried across the lawn with floral bouquets, digital cameras, and the sort of nervous smiles that only accompany monumental endings. Today was not just a graduation, it was a coronation. But Thomas Reed, weathered and gray, stood apart from all that brightness, his coat a faded relic of a war few remembered, and his boots whispering a story no one wanted to ask about. He held a small envelope in one calloused hand, creased and fingerprinted, with his son's handwriting on it. "Dad, if you read this, I want you at the front row." No signature, no sentiment, just a line that meant everything. Thomas approached the entrance of the ceremony with a hesitant step. A young staff member in a blazer intercepted him before he could reach the velvet ropes. "Sir, this area is for registered guests only," the young man said, his smile courteous but rigid, like someone reciting lines from a policy manual. His eyes glanced over Thomas's coat, too worn, too old, and settled on the dusty boots. Thomas offered the envelope with slow hands. "My boy asked me to come." The staffer looked at the note, blinked, then gave a shallow shake of the head. "I'm sorry. We can't confirm that. You'll need to step back behind the main seating." Thomas didn't argue. He didn't scowl, or insist or plead. He simply nodded, a small motion that looked more like retreat than agreement, and turned away. He walked along the edge of the ceremony, boots brushing quietly across the cement, until he reached a narrow column near the back of the auditorium. From there, behind the flood of chairs and families and congratulatory applause, he stood. Invisible. No one noticed him. No one wanted to. The few who glimpsed him assumed he was lost, or worse, one of those old men who wandered into public events just to remember what it felt like to belong. But Thomas didn't seek sympathy. He didn't need it. He had stood behind worse things than velvet ropes. In rain, in dust, in gunfire. He folded the envelope back into his pocket like it was part of his uniform and rested his hand against the column's cool stone. He could see the stage from there, not clearly, but enough. Enough to spot his son when he walked across it. That would be enough. Children pointed in different directions. Laughter echoed like bells off the tall stone arches. A young woman with a baby stroller brushed past him without apology. Someone dropped a program and didn't pick it up. It settled at his feet. Thomas bent to retrieve it, handed it back silently. The person didn't even meet his eyes. His gaze lifted again, scanning the rows of polished shoes and shiny name tags and proud parents. It was a different kind of battlefield, he thought. One built not with bullets, but with status, with proximity, with who you were sitting next to. And still he stood, a silent sentinel in a world that had forgotten how to see. He wasn't just a father. He was his father. The man who used to carry Evan on his back through backwoods trails. The man who taught him to aim with both eyes open, not just to hit a mark, but to understand it. The man who never sent birthday cards, because he was always away, deployed, working, recovering, but who once sent a pocket knife with the initials YAR, etched in crooked letters, and a note that said, "Your hands are stronger than mine were at your age. Use them well." He never knew if Evan kept that knife. They hadn't spoken in over a year. Not because of anger. Just distance. The kind that grew silently between two people who once shared everything until the silence itself became a language. Now Thomas stood here, in the language of shadows, watching the stage where his son would soon become something more than a boy with strong hands. A scholar. A man. He didn't need applause. He didn't want recognition. But in the echo of every clapping parent, every camera flash, every cheer, there was a quiet question in Thomas's mind. Would Evan see him? Would he remember? And, if not, would standing here still mean something? He stayed anyway. Because fathers don't need invitations to stand where their children become more than themselves. They just need reasons. And Thomas Reed had one. He had always had one. The name echoed through the loudspeaker like a final bell before silence. Evan Reed, Bachelor of Political Science, summa cum laude. There was a pause, a fraction of breath. Then came the applause, rising like a tide across the courtyard. Polite, proud, perfunctory. Parents rose. Phones lifted. Friends whistled. Thomas didn't move. Not yet. He saw Evan step onto the stage. The boy walked like a man who had finally escaped the long shadow of expectation, shoulders squared beneath a navy blue robe, hair neat, jaw tightened with something between determination and fatigue. He didn't smile, not fully. His mouth twitched in the corner, almost reluctant, as though he was trying to remain composed for someone watching. Maybe a professor. Maybe a friend. Maybe someone he wasn't sure would be there. Thomas held his breath as his son took the diploma with both hands, bowed lightly, then turned to face the crowd. It happened in a moment, barely a heartbeat. Evan scanned the audience, not with the empty sweep of someone basking in attention, but with a searching intensity, like a soldier checking every window for a signal. Row by row, eyes sharp, unreadable, until they landed on something. Or someone. He froze. Thomas didn't wave, didn't raise his hand or nod. He just stood, his eyes locked on his son with a kind of quiet command honed by years of watching through scopes and smoke and loss. His face was unreadable, except for the eyes, those pale gray-blue eyes that always spoke louder than his voice. And in that second Evan saw him. There was no smile, no dramatic swell of music, just a flicker of recognition. But it was enough to change everything. Because Evan's eyes softened. Just slightly. Just long enough to betray that behind the stoic front of academic triumph, there was still a boy who once looked up from scraped knees for approval and now saw it standing quietly behind the last row, next to a stone column, wearing a coat that had no business at a graduation. He didn't cry. He didn't wave. But the air around him shifted. He turned slightly, as though his walk off the stage might angle just a bit closer to the man watching. And Thomas? He didn't move. Didn't smile. But his chest rose in a way it hadn't in years. Slow. Heavy, full. Not with pride, exactly. Pride was for trophies. This was something older. Deeper. Like the wind that passed through both of them and somehow said, I see you. I remember. The ceremony continued. Another name called, another cheer erupting. Evan disappeared behind the curtain. But Thomas didn't leave. Not yet. He remained at his post like always, a shadow beside the column, as if waiting for a signal no one else could see. And then it came. Not footsteps. Not words. A quiet shuffle. A figure cutting through the crowd from the far side of the stage. It was Evan, robe open now, diploma held low in one hand. He moved quickly, head low, like someone sneaking out of formation. He came straight toward the edge of the courtyard, toward the column, toward his father. When they stood face to face, the distance between them was less than a foot and more than 10 years. Neither of them spoke. The silence swelled like a heartbeat between thunder and rain. Then Evan looked up, and his eyes, God, his eyes, spoke everything his mouth never could. They didn't ask for forgiveness. They didn't beg for stories. They didn't even explain. They just said, You came. And Thomas, who had stood through mortar fire and the slow rot of memory, felt something in him unclench. He nodded once, barely, and met his son's gaze with the steadiness of a man who had nothing left to prove and everything left to feel. The two stood there, surrounded by noise and laughter and the rustle of caps and gowns, like islands in a river. There were no hugs, no speeches, just a long, searching look between two men who had lost time and somehow found each other again inside one shared truth. When the world forgets you, the eyes remember. And in that remembered gaze, they both came home. The reception was noisy, full of champagne flutes and laughter too loud to be real. Faculty members posed like diplomats, and proud parents clutched their children as though they had just returned from war. But Thomas remained at the edge of it all, a relic in a borrowed room. He didn't belong in glass buildings with polished floors and catered hors d'oeuvres. He belonged to foggy mornings and the quiet rhythm of a rifle being cleaned. Evan had drifted back into the crowd, caught in the pull of classmates and expectations. They hadn't spoken, not with words. But the look had been real. That was enough. Thomas could leave now. He had come, been seen, and in that fragile look from his son, he had mattered. He reached for his coat. Then something shifted. A sound. A tremor in the noise. It wasn't the laugh of students or the clink of glass. It was sharper, darker. A voice raised not in joy, but in challenge. It sliced through the music like a crack in stained glass. "Hey, Reed. You still hiding behind that dead war vet?" Thomas paused, turned. 3 boys stood near the back wall, dressed like adults but wearing the permanent smirk of inherited entitlement. One of them, tall, pale, groomed like a senator's son, had a drink in his hand and poison in his eyes. He pointed toward Evan. "You think just 'cause he's here today you get to pretend he ever gave a damn?" Evan didn't answer. He just froze. The crowd didn't notice. Or didn't care. They never did. But Thomas heard it, the same way he used to hear the distant rustle of movement in the jungle when no one else could. He moved forward. Slowly. Controlled. The boy continued. "He's not a hero. He's a fossil. A ghost with medals. You want worse stories, Reed? Maybe ask why the guy with honor abandoned his hole." The sentence never finished. Because a hand fell on the boy's shoulder. Not Thomas's. Not Evan's. It was someone else. An older man in a brown jacket, body heavy with age, but spine perfectly straight. His hand gripped the boy's shoulder with the calm precision of someone who once dragged wounded men through gunfire. "Say it again, son," the man said softly. "I dare you." The boy blinked. "Who the hell are?" But he didn't finish that either. Because another man had appeared beside the first. Then another. And another. 6 in total. They weren't dressed for ceremony. One wore jeans and boots with dust on the hem. Another had sleeves rolled up over arms marked by burns and old ink. One had a limp. Another had no left hand. They didn't look like much. Until you looked closer. Until you saw the eyes. The stillness. The scars that didn't need explaining. One by one, they closed in, not with aggression but with something colder. Accountability. The room hadn't gone silent yet. Not fully. But the ripple had started. People were turning. Sensing something off script. Thomas said nothing. He didn't need to. He stood last, behind the 6, like the final page in a book already written. The boy stammered, stepped back. I was just kidding." But the first man shook his head. "You don't joke about ghosts you don't understand. And you don't talk about men who bled, so you could talk at all." Another veteran leaned in. "That man you mocked? He buried friends before your daddy grew a backbone." A third said, "You think sacrifice is something you tweet about? That man stayed alive so others wouldn't have to write their kids' names on stone." The boy had gone pale. He turned to leave, but the 6 didn't stop him. They didn't need to. They'd already won. Because Evan had seen it. All of it. He stood behind the wall of old warriors, his mouth slightly open. Not in fear, but revelation. These weren't just men. They were his father's shadows. His history. His brothers. And they stood for him now. No medals. No speeches. Just presence. Just truth. And in that silence after the boy slinked away, Thomas finally stepped forward. His voice was low, but it cut through the air like a bell in winter. "You can forget a name. You can erase a file. But a man's dignity? That survives in those who remember." He didn't look at Evan when he said it. But Evan looked at him. And the 6? They nodded, slow and solemn, before drifting apart like smoke returning to the wind. No applause followed. Just quiet. But for Evan, something permanent had changed. He had seen what the world refused to honor. Not power, but presence. Not revenge, but remembrance. And when he turned back to his father, he didn't see the ghost. He saw the reason 6 warriors stood up when one was dishonored. He saw what it truly meant to belong to a legacy that never needed a stage to speak. The night air felt heavier than it should. Outside the university hall, the floodlights carved pale shapes onto the ground, but Thomas stood in shadow, half-shielded by a row of trimmed hedges. The celebration inside still murmured behind glass, but he had stepped away, not to retreat, but to breathe. He was used to silence. In the jungle, it had meant survival. In the years since, it had been protection. But tonight, after all that had happened, the look from Evan, the 6 men rising, the confrontation he didn't have to fight. Tonight, silence felt different. Like a weight beginning to lift. Or maybe, just maybe, an invitation. Evan found him there. He didn't say anything at first. Just stood beside him, hands buried in the pockets of his dress pants. The tie hung loosened, the ceremony now a memory that already seemed shallow compared to what had just unfolded. He looked at his father, not as a stranger, not as a question mark, but as someone he was finally beginning to see. "I didn't know they'd come," Thomas said, his voice rough but quiet. Evan shook his head. "They didn't come for me." "No," Thomas nodded. "They came for the truth." The boy, the one who had mocked, had been escorted out. The party was winding down. But Evan had stayed back, not out of obligation anymore, but because something had shifted inside. The story he had always believed, of a father who disappeared, who abandoned responsibility, who chose war over family, was unraveling. "I used to think you didn't care," Evan said, his voice trembling in the cold. "You missed everything, my birthday, my first game, Mom's funeral." Thomas closed his eyes. "That one hurt. Always." "I know," he whispered. "And there's not a day I don't carry that." Evan turned, angry, not at his father, but at time itself. "Then why? Why did you vanish after she died? Why didn't you come back?" Thomas looked down at his hands, the same hands that once held dying comrades, that once dug through debris for children in burning villages, that once trembled when he signed his discharge papers. "Because I was broken," he said. "Not just tired. Not just sad. Broken in a way I didn't know how to fix. Your mother, she was the only one who ever understood what I carried. When she was gone, I didn't have the courage to face the world without her. Or to face you." The words hit like rain after drought. "I thought you'd be better without me," he continued. "I thought if I stayed away, maybe you'd grow up without the shadow of what I'd become. I didn't want you to carry my ghosts." Evan's throat tightened. "But I was carrying them. I just didn't know their names." That silence returned again, not empty this time, but full, heavy with memory and meaning. "You left medals on my bed when I was 9, Evan said, quieter now. "I found them in a shoebox. One had blood on the ribbon." Thomas exhaled. "I was trying to explain the only way I knew. Words, they didn't work back then." "And the letter?" Thomas looked up, startled. Evan pulled a folded, yellowed envelope from his coat. "You tucked this in the case. I never opened it until last year. I didn't want to read excuses. But when I finally did..." He handed it over. Thomas took it, fingers trembling slightly. "You didn't write about glory," Evan said. "You wrote about fear. About holding your friend's hand when his legs were gone. About watching children scream in villages you were told to save. You didn't pretend to be a hero. You didn't ask for forgiveness. You just told the truth." Thomas blinked hard. "I wrote it on a hotel nightstand. Didn't even know if I had the right." "You did," Evan whispered. "You do." The wind picked up. A leaf danced past them, caught in a shaft of light. "I hated you for so long," Evan confessed. "But tonight, when those 6 men stood up, when they looked at you like you mattered, it was the first time I realized something. Maybe you didn't leave because you didn't care. Maybe you left because you cared too much." Thomas said nothing. But something in him, something deeply locked, began to loosen. "I want to know you," Evan said. And that broke the dam. Thomas reached out, hesitant, like a man who hadn't touched the world in decades. Evan stepped into the embrace, no longer a boy, no longer a stranger. They stood there for a long time. No audience, no applause, just a father and a son at the edge of years, finding each other not in answers, but in the willingness to see. When they finally pulled back, Evan looked him in the eye. "Come home," he said. And for the first time in years, Thomas nodded. Not as a soldier, but as a father finally returning from war. The town's veteran memorial park had never been particularly grand. A few stone benches, a simple fountain, plaques lined with names that time had mostly forgotten. It wasn't the kind of place where tourists stopped, or even where locals lingered. But on that quiet Sunday morning, something about it felt sacred. Thomas sat alone on the cold stone bench, just beneath the flag that fluttered gently above. He wore a simple brown coat, threadbare at the elbows, and clutched a small wooden box on his lap. The sun had just begun to rise behind the trees, casting long golden fingers across the grass and gravel and bathing the park in a soft, reverent light. He was waiting, but not for ceremony, not for recognition. Not anymore. The small wooden box contained the medals he had once hidden, ashamed to wear them, afraid they would scream louder than he ever could. Each one held a story, most of them not his own. Stories of men who never came home, of decisions made under fire, of guilt wrapped in valor. They were not decorations to Thomas. They were burdens and blessings. Until now, he had never known what to do with them. Evan appeared at the edge of the park, walking slowly toward him. No fanfare, no entourage, just a son making a choice. He carried a folded American flag in his arms, the one that had once been presented to Thomas's unit after their last mission, and then handed off like an unwanted memory. Evan had found it in an attic chest weeks ago, dusty and rigid with time. Today it was clean, pressed, and held like something sacred. As Evan approached, Thomas stood. No words were exchanged. They didn't need them. Evan placed the flag gently on the bench between them. Then slowly he sat. His eyes were clear, his jaw firm. But his voice, when it came, cracked at the edges. "I've been thinking about what it means to be proud," he said. "For a long time, I thought pride was about winning, about being celebrated, being seen. But maybe it's not." Thomas said nothing, his hand resting lightly atop the wooden box. "Maybe real pride," Evan continued, "is quieter than that. Maybe it's carrying something no one else understands. Doing what's right when no one claps for you. Standing when everyone else runs." He looked at his father, eyes full of something raw and true. "You never told me who you were, Dad. But now I see it."
"You didn't need to tell me."
"You showed me." Thomas's throat tightened. He opened the wooden box slowly, revealing the medals. He ran his fingers over each one like tracing names on a tombstone. "Do you think they'd forgive me?" he asked, voice hoarse. Evan looked down, then back up. "I think they already did. You carried them farther than any of us ever could." There was a stillness, then a sacred pause, like the space between breaths in a prayer. Thomas took out the medals one by one and laid them gently beneath the flag. Not to discard them, but to offer them. Not to hide, but to honor. People began to arrive, slowly. Not a crowd, just a handful. Old men with canes. Women with folded hands and weary eyes. A young boy with freckles. A middle-aged man in a postal uniform. One by one, they came and stood, not around the bench, but behind it. Quiet. Present. Among them were the 6 men from the university hall. They didn't wear uniforms.
But their posture said everything. Thomas turned, surprised.
One of them, a tall man with a deep scar over his brow, spoke first. "You never asked us to come," he said. "But we've always known where to find you." Thomas swallowed hard. He opened his arms slightly, unsure, but willing. They stepped forward. A hand on the shoulder. A nod. No need for rank or speeches. Just men honoring something deeper than ceremony. Evan stood and joined them. No uniform. No insignia. Just a son who had seen the truth and had chosen not to turn away. A local pastor, quiet and gray, approached the front of the group. He looked around, then back at Thomas. "Would you like to say something?" Thomas hesitated. Then he stepped forward. Only a few paces. "Enough. I've made a lot of mistakes," he began. "I ran from things I should have faced. I hid because I didn't believe I was worth remembering. But these men, these people, you all reminded me that sometimes the deepest kind of honor is living with the memory. Carrying it, not as shame, but as fuel." He turned to Evan. "And when someone believes in you, even after silence, you find your voice again." He looked down at the flag, at the medals, then back up. I'm not a hero, but I stood beside them. And that is something I'll always be proud of. There was no applause, just quiet. And then, as if guided by something unspoken, the crowd placed their hands over their hearts. The flag rustled gently overhead, and Thomas, with his back straight and his eyes lifted to the light, offered a quiet, solemn salute. Not for the cameras, not for the past, but for something greater than both: the dignity of being truly seen. Would you like this series polished into a single continuous story for publishing or formatting?